Hello, everyone, and welcome to SANSFire 2021. An alert has been fired. Now what? Sponsored by Corelight. My name is Jessica Galaxa Sands, and I'll be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speaker is Alex Kirk, Global Principal Engineer. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenter, please enter them into the Q&A window located on the control panel or in the chat at any time. Please note that a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be made available for viewing and can be found within the SANS webcast archives. And with that, I'd like to turn the webcast over to Alex.
All right, thank you very much. Gonna go ahead and get started here with a little bit about who I am, including a little bit of what I look like, since we're all still stuck in a virtual world, and a face to a name is generally a good thing. But career-wise, the thing that kind of establishes me to give the talk today is I've spent the last 17 years in the information security realm, specifically working with commercial companies that do open source products. So that was a career that started out at SOCs and later ended up at Cisco through that acquisition, included time at Tenable, and now I'm here at Corelight representing Zeek and Suricata as the core product lines. I am a previous researcher. The 10 years I spent at SOCs was with the research team, doing everything from writing our first malware sandbox to establishing a global intel sharing program. But I've gone to the more practical side of the house, being a field engineer these days, working with companies to actually try to implement all the pie in the sky from the research in the real world. And so that's what we're going to be speaking to a lot today. I've also been a frequent presenter at SANS and other venues, so I hope that means that I'm entertaining enough that you'll enjoy today's presentation and get something out of it as well. So I want to go ahead and set the stage for kind of where we are as an industry. And I know a lot of you have heard these things plenty of times before, so I'll kind of go quickly through it. But according to any of the different sources that you look to, SOCs, a majority of them are still struggling to keep up with the volume of alerts that is coming in today. And more than 20% of breaches are still going undetected for months at a time. And while that's certainly better than the majority of them, as was the case 10 years ago, for an industry where we've all collectively spent 20 plus years trying to figure things out and spent billions of dollars in the process trying to do it, it's still a very sad state of affairs. Particularly when you realize that the majority of the breach detections that are out there are still happening because the FBI has come knocking on your door, or a bank that you do business with has detected fraud, or some other entity that is not your security team actually finding the breach. And a big part of the reason why that is some really kind of simple math that came out of the 2019 SANS SOC survey that I wanted to share here. So according to that survey, the average enterprise SOC is getting something on the order of about 10,000 alerts per day. And the most common sort of size of SOC in terms of analysts who are charged with actually reviewing those events is somewhere between 2 and 10 people. And if we assume for just a moment that humans are robots and are going to use every single minute of that time perfectly efficiently, then there are 480 minutes we can use in a standard 8-hour shift to calculate the fact that even if you've got those 10 analysts on the higher end of things, you're still talking about 1,000 alerts per analyst, which in those 8-hour shifts equates to 2 alerts per minute that they would need to be processing in order to keep up with the flow of noise out of a tool like an IDS. And of course, the reality is that resolution is typically 10 or more minutes per alert out in the real world, which is why it's so common to have organizations that are simply not processing anything but the most critical and the highest priority of the events that come through. Now, part of the reason that people have sort of accepted this state of affairs is that even the folks who are the experts in the industry trying to explain how to do security right for the people trying to understand, like you in the audience today, are telling them how complex things really are. This is a MITRE attack mapping for one specific APT with all the distinct data sources and mitigations that might be relevant to detecting and keeping them out of the network. Now, I don't know about you, but for me, even as someone who's been doing this day in and day out for almost 2 decades, looking at this makes my head hurt. And it gives folks cover to say, well, it's just too complicated to actually do all this stuff right. And I'm going to make my best effort out here in the field. But it's no surprise that an attacker got by me when it's this complicated to find them and deal with them in the first place. It's also what gives rise to a vendor culture that so many of us have seen out in the field of folks who want to sell you, literal black boxes with blinking lights on the side, sometimes with a little shiny APT sticker, that really are the epitome of we're smarter than you, and we're going to go ahead and do all that work from that mapping that you saw a moment ago behind the scenes and spit out a product that the average consumer of this can actually do something with. Well, the problem is that if you look at the details of a lot of these systems very closely, you'll realize that much like this image, which is literally a image from the website of a cybersecurity vendor that I found while putting this presentation together, they really haven't necessarily thought things through as well as you might think. For example, why is it that they've got giant picture windows allowing the sun to shine into a data center in the middle of the summer and cook all their servers? Why have they put their critical assets next to what looks like a potentially volatile oil rig? And of course, they're also not reminding you of the fact that AI and machine learning are by far the most despised categories of detection because of the false positive rates that they have and the difficulty in interpreting them, or the fact that really advanced attackers have gone out and bought a lot of this technology and QA'd against it. So it is not going to be nearly as effective as they lead you to believe. So, given this state of affairs, the question becomes, what can you do differently than trying to buy a box to make things go away? Well, everyone is out there looking for the easy button. They want to just, be able to spend a little bit of money on a product and have all their worries go out. The problem is that there really is no easy button when it comes to security. In fact, it's much more akin to building a winning team, because fundamentally you have to have a group of individuals who can work together with a common toolkit and a common set of processes or plays, to use the sports metaphor, to achieve a result where they're able to maneuver through the field of battle, so to speak, against adversaries in the cyber world more fluidly, more rapidly, and more intelligently than those adversaries themselves can as they come into a given network and have to reconnoiter their way around it to do anything useful. And so to speak to that process a little bit, what I wanted to do is frame this for the remainder of the talk in terms of a pyramid of IR capabilities that was actually published by Matt Swan, one of the chief security architects at Microsoft. And I know that a lot of people like to talk smack about Microsoft in the security industry, but certainly as an organization that I've worked closely with across my career, I've seen them do a lot of good things in that area. So don't let the man's employer dissuade you from listening to this pyramid, because fundamentally I think he's got things correct in terms of the capabilities that are necessary to build that solid security process. Here at the bottom with the inventory layer is the classic mantra that you can't protect what you don't know about, and this certainly applies to the security of a given network, whether it's not knowing that an asset existed in the first place or simply not having a view into what sorts of software is running on it and what vulnerabilities might be present in it. You're certainly going to need telemetry across your network as well, and you're going to need it at an appropriate level of depth that is going to be able to tell you all the things that your security team needs to know as it's investigating, without overrunning your disks like something like a full packet capture is going to do. Now, these layers, of course, all interplay as well. So detection is made a lot cleaner to actually do something with when you have a clear understanding of the asset inventory and can figure out if a particular alert applies to a particular type of system. And being able to see what happened before, during, and after that detection is going to give you a lot more confidence in terms of the validity of the detection or not, based upon whether or not any malicious activity was observed following When we talk about triage as well, certainly understanding exactly where those detections were seen and what other sorts of indicators came out of those compromised systems once the detection was able to validate an attack is going to allow you to really go through and understand the scope of that detection much more broadly on your network very quickly. And certainly as we get further up the pyramid here, all of these things continue to apply. But it's all about building that solid base at the beginning to really make all of these things sing further along. So, where exactly do you want to go about getting that data is a big part of the question for enterprises today. And the industry really has coalesced around the concepts of the SOC triad, and rightfully so, because fundamentally, you're going to be able to get data off of your actual endpoint systems, the machines that make up the network itself. But you're also going to need to pull data from the network itself for the simple reason that endpoint coverage, as deep as it may go in ways that network coverage cannot, is never going to be as broad as the view on the network. Your SolarWinds devices are never going to have an EDR installed on them, for example. And so between that and just the classic issue of sprawl within networks and endpoints that might be able to have an agent installed on them, missing them due to policy reasons, you need to have that network view to broaden things out and really make the picture clearer than you would get with endpoint alone. And of course, you're going to want to centralize all of that in some sort of integrated analytics stack in the middle that can bring these two data points together and combine them with threat intelligence to give you effective alerting in your environment. Now, saying all of that, it sounds really super easy to actually do, but I'm sure plenty of you know that the reality is a little bit different. And so the question is, why is it that such a simple concept is so difficult to implement? Well, the reality of it is that it probably looks something like this in your environment today. Because the pattern for most organizations is to pull data from a whole variety of different sources, whether you're talking about application servers, network devices, security devices, endpoint, and bring all of those into a centralized pane of glass where that knowledge layer can be applied on top of all these logs. Well, that's all well and good from a breadth and coverage perspective, but when you actually get into the nuts and bolts of doing this, what you're quickly going to find is that there is no common format between any of these logs. They're all coming from different vendors with different levels of detail, with no concept of normalization between them. And while certainly there have been data models springing up within the SIM space, Splunk's Common Information Model, the Elastic Common Schema, not all products comply to these specifications, and having a whole host of different applications trying to adhere to a model increases the risk that any one of them deviates from the model at any given point in time. More importantly, too, from a management and maintenance perspective, operationalizing within the business, needing to touch all of these different sources, both for an initial setup process to turn the logs on in the first place, but also from an ongoing maintenance perspective of making sure that all these different sources are up and that a sysadmin didn't come through to your firewall and turn down logging to save CPUs on an overburdened device. It is complex and prone to failure. And so really what the objective should be when you're talking about data collection in an environment is to consolidate data sources as much as possible to make it cleaner to actually join them together and do something useful within the SIM. So in terms of what kinds of data sources you're going to want to use for something like this, some of the criteria that you should have in mind, first of all, is that those data sources are going to be broadly applicable. You want to kill multiple birds with one stone, so to speak. And so if you've got a way, for example, to take a Corelight device and apply its logs of the network across all of those protocols listed on that last slide, the DNS, the HTTP, the SMTP, et cetera, you're going to be able to manage and monitor that data in a much cleaner way, and be able to take your administrative burden down very dramatically. Equally important, I think, is you want to be bringing teams within your enterprise organization together. This graph here is out of that same SANSFire survey, and talks about the failure of SOCs and NOCs to actually work together here. We can see that the majority of them only are working together when there's an emergency. They have very little direct communication. There is no reason why here in the year 2021, we shouldn't be bringing data sources in that can apply across multiple teams to bring their processes together and bring their unique knowledge of a given enterprise all in the same room, so that we can be going against adversaries as a common united front instead of a bunch of fragmented teams, each doing their own thing in their own little enclave. Now, you also want to have open systems wherever possible when generating this kind of data. If you're talking about something that is going to go through and log events for security items, for example, you're going to want to be able to look into what is actually the criteria for generating that event in the first place. Much like this magnifying glass, you can go out and understand the physics of light and how it enhances the image. With open source detections coming into a system and open source frameworks and standards around the data, you can see exactly why something was done, when it was done, and how that applies to your specific network and whether or not it is valid indeed. You're certainly also going to want to have something that is open API driven and designed to integrate with the rest of your environment. Successful security programs really have all of their flow and process in a coherent, unified whole, as opposed to pivoting between a bunch of distinct consoles and data points and views on all this information. And so if you're working with a tool that doesn't provide an open standards API driven way to get its data in to the place where you need it, then you need to be looking at a different tool. Now, of course, the final thing you want to consider when picking out a data point is that you want to have a log source that generates the correct amount of data. And a classic example of this is folks who are logging DNS off of their Active Directory servers, which is all well and good if you only need the queries that are being made within an environment, which is the case when you're trying to make sure that your Active Directory server is up and operational and doing its job. But if you want the answers to these queries, which is vitally important for tracking down, say, a hit to a malicious domain off of an Intel reputation feed, then doing it in Active Directory, let's put it this way. I had one customer who tried to do that and found that the CPU overhead of making the 80 logs verbose enough to contain the answers was so great that they would have had to upgrade their entire Active Directory forest to support it, as opposed to being able to get that data point off the network and a variety of others as well with the Corelight appliance. Now, in addition to that, you want to make sure that you're architected intelligently to get valid data. I call out Infoblox here specifically, not because they have a bad product. In fact, it's a perfectly excellent DNS security appliance, but because it's so common for us to see architectures where Infoblox is feeding off of the Active Directory parent resolver, and you get alerts all day long, but without the true client IP generating that request, thus rendering your ability to do anything remediative with these alerts much more reduced than it would be otherwise. Of course, you certainly also don't want to use something like packet capture that is going to have too much data and not allow you any kind of retention. In fact, what you're really looking for is something akin to a Corelight Zeek DNS log here, which is going to give you all of the relevant information about a transaction without all the associated heavy data in a packet capture, and in a format that is easily accessible to a security analyst trying to do their job. So going back to the pyramid now and starting to talk through some of these things in detail and give some recommendations. I want to start with asset and inventory management, which I can tell you from my time at Tenable is absolutely the least favorite topic of every IT operations and security team that I've spoken to. And the reason, of course, that it's their least favorite topic is because vulnerability scanners that are often the basis of asset management in organizations are loud, noisy, awful things. The first thing you need to do in any IDS deployment, for example, is to whitelist all of your vulnerability scanners so they don't just throw off a giant pile of noise for your SOC team to sift through. And because of the amount of bandwidth that they suck up on the network, the amount of false positive alerts they can throw, because of the system resources consumed by the systems that are being scanned in some cases, most organizations are limiting those sorts of scans to a periodic 30-day was average for my customer base sort of a basis. And of course, we all know that with the amount of sprawl in modern networks and dynamic spinning up and down of assets, that is nowhere close to sufficient in terms of building a complete picture out of your network. And so, the question becomes, how do you go about getting truth in terms of what assets are actually on your network and what they're doing? And I would say that it's, to do it right is a combination of endpoint and network data. Of course, trying to do asset inventory off of endpoint agents is prone to the same issues I brought up earlier about out of policy devices or missing systems. But a lot of modern vulnerability scanning, of course, also revolves around credentialed scans into endpoints that give you data that you're simply not going to get off of the network directly. And so that level of integration is very important to establishing the level of depth necessary to be able to answer all of the questions in detection and triage above as your analysts work to these things. But another important point of the process is going to be the network and the network level observations. And one of the things that is outside the typical paradigm of active scanning that you can do is passively monitoring for assets in the environment. Tenable actually has an entire product line that they will sell you to specifically listen to the network and augment its asset map based upon sightings of devices that might not have been present in the last active scan. And while they were certainly thought leaders in terms of bringing a product like that to the market and completing the network and endpoint bridge from an asset and vulnerability management perspective, I would not advise you to buy that technology specifically because it is so narrowly applicable to the asset management problem, as opposed to what I'm going to show you a little bit later with some other vulnerability management integration tricks that we're up to here at Corelight. So to jump ahead into detection a little bit, I want to set the stage and talk about CVE matching for IDS alert priority, which is a concept that SORCEFire pioneered all the way back in 2003, but is still surprisingly uncommon within a lot of IDS implementations in the market, especially given the simplicity of the idea. A case in point would be if you've got a signature that is fired and there's a CVE referred to in there for an Apache web server, but the target host that was being shot at is running Microsoft IIS, well, then pretty confidently at that point, then you can go ahead and dump that alert into the bin and continue moving on to higher priority things. But of course, if you have an Apache server installed on that endpoint and through vulnerability data that CVE is present on the box, then you've got a giant red flag on your hands and you need to prioritize that event as something that is potentially much more serious. And so what we've actually done literally within the last couple of weeks over here is written a Zeek script that will interact with vulnerability data to match on the alert itself and say, hey, the responding host here is known vulnerable to that specific CVE that is applicable to this signature. This is something that we're going to make more turnkey within the product going forward, but is also very easily done for those folks of you out in the open source world as well. The concept is pretty basic. The script to do it was engineered within a couple of hours but the value that it's going to provide out to the marketplace obviously is substantially higher in terms of helping folks actually prioritize and process their alerts. Now, where this comes back in, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself here. What I wanted to point out is that this is all being accomplished through the Zeek input framework, which is a generic way to put data into the engine and allow for additional correlation and intelligence to be brought in. And it's readily available within the Corelight UI, so you don't have to do a lot of back-end scripting or other work to make it function. But one of the other things that I wanted to point out that we have customers doing with this today is asset enrichment out of their CMDB. Folks who might be familiar with the Zeek conlog will recognize that we've got some additional fields here that are going to give data out of a CMDB to say, hey, this person is working remotely. We know from HR that they live in Austin. Has got a regular workstation there in sales. This is the user, et cetera. And this obviously allows you to not only prioritize events that might come out of executive management or other high value assets, but it makes the process of remediation considerably easier when you do get an event that you deem to be valid, because then you know exactly which department within an organization is responsible for a given asset and can be told to go start the process of cleanup and triage. But one of the things that we can do with this input framework and its ability to enrich data that we're moving forward on today is in the case of the vulnerability scanner, listing Tenable here as my favorite in that market space, has brought CVE data into Corelight with a giant asset map. It's very possible for us to cross-reference to that map and say, hey, we've got evidence that a host is on the network that the vulnerability management system knows nothing about. And at that point, we can use their open APIs to pop back in and say either, hey, I want to go ahead and do an on-demand scan of this device right now because it just had an alert fired on it and we need to know more about it to determine what the priority is. Or even just, I want to put this on my target list for my next scheduled scan so that I can ensure that I'm sweeping through the environment more properly and getting a better baseline of asset and inventory data. Now, since I've alluded to CMDBs as well, I'll also point out that if you're using a technology like ServiceNow, who are sort of the kings of the asset management game, there is existing code today between someone like a Tenable and a ServiceNow to do asset enrichment based upon what's being discovered in the vulnerability management layer. Well, if Corelight is augmenting that vulnerability management layer, then that can flow directly through into the CMDB and asset management, and really, again, bring IT operations and security and network all together in a way that you wouldn't have without such a common data set. There is also potential, obviously, for more enrichment directly between Corelight and ServiceNow. It'll just depend upon what the market wants, what sort of code we sit down and write. Now, coming back into the telemetry layer for a little bit, since we sort of skipped ahead to detection to tell you that story, understanding what is taking place in the environment really makes that processing of detections and alerts considerably easier. And so as an example here, I'm highlighting a Suricata alert for a potential PHP remote file include, which anybody who runs a set of web servers knows is sort of the scourge of the internet. There's so many bots running around trying to do PHP file uploads that you'll generate thousands of these things on a routine basis. Well, if you can pivot from your alerts directly into metadata about the HTTP transaction and be able to see that, oh, that came back with a 404 not found, it's very easy to discard this event and move along to something much more interesting. And of course, the beauty of that is all very much subject to automation, particularly if you've got a kind of a SOAR framework in place or considering one in the future. I call out Phantom in particular, because Corelight has built some playbooks that are actually available on the Phantom GitHub today, one of which goes after, like I said, one of the more common security alerting issues in every SOC, which is a potentially malicious DNS hit. And so because of that consolidated and linked data, it's very easy for us to take an alert from Suricata and loop back into our DNS logs to find out whether or not the query got any answers. And if so, loop through those answers and look to figure out if connections were made to those respondent IP addresses, and if so, whether or not any data was actually transferred on those connections, and then be able to go through and pull out, one set of indicators for HTTP, where you've got a host and a user agent and a response MIME type and things like that, or a different set for SSL, where you've got certificate information or J3 hashes or other relevant TLS wrapper data. We can pull files at wire speed with the product. We've actually got one customer doing 15,000 a minute in their environment. And so it's very easy to pipe those through into a virus total, for example, to find out if there's a known match on any of those, as well as loop to see if there are any Suricata events being generated on the responding connection off of this potentially malicious query, so that you're, again, wrapping up things all in one tidy picture for the analyst, and giving them a much faster, clearer workflow and a path to actually be able to process all the events that are showing up within the environment. Now, if you don't want to get into advanced source sort of applications like that, but you're still looking to tune your IDS alerts, one of the things that is very relevant to the combination of Zeek and Suricata here in Corelight is the ability to kind of cross-reference data streams. And I'll take this in the context of a specific ET Pro signature that I have seen fire on multiple client installations quite a bit. It's this SMB2 create AndX request for an executable file. Now, you read that description, and what immediately springs to mind is I'm going to find some sort of super lead advanced attacker using these sorts of lateral movement tools within the environment. But what we've actually found out in the wild, and I've seen confirmed on, I couldn't tell you how many different forum posts on the internet when I searched the other day, is that the majority of these alerts are actually coming from Active Directory doing group policy scripts. In fact, we had some clients that were generating upwards of 60,000 alerts on this specific signature per day for their Active Directory environments. And the reason I call this out in particular is that for all of the installations where we've seen this, we've found that those group policy scripts typically have at least one file with a name that is relatively static within a given environment. And so it's very easy to say, all right, if I see this alert fire, but the associated stream shows me that some of the file names that are coming down are those group policy files, then I can go ahead and suppress that natively on the sensor based upon the combination of those two data fields. And so prevent that from ever going upstream into a SIM. Now, of course, a lot of folks would say, well, you can just turn off a signature like that altogether if it's so noisy. But the reality of it is, if you can filter out things that you know to be benign based upon the metadata that is natively linked into your alerts, then you're going to be able to keep that sort of detection on to actually find things that might be considerably more malicious within the environment. So coming up that pyramid even further to the concept of triage, I'll take the SolarWinds example as a perfect one, because there were so many environments that we worked with or heard about that simply didn't even know if they had SolarWinds installed at all. Large enterprise environments are often bad about maintaining tools, in particular between departments. And for someone that has network telemetry, it's very easy in the case of SolarWinds to be able to pick on the fact that they send plain text HTTP queries within the network and pull out their specific user agent string and be able to determine exactly where you've got to go pay attention to when a breach like that occurs. But even equally importantly is the fact that because you have the telemetry about everything that's been done over DNS in your environment over, we had some customers that had more than a year worth of these logs stored by the time that the breach came around. Um, it's as simple as a query like this when you get an indicator in from a breach like that to be able to sit down and determine scope and understand if you've truly been compromised or not. In fact, we had one customer organization who was able to run this specific query in their environment. They found a number of infected systems that had done stage 1 beaconing, but because they had the answers to all their DNS queries, they saw that they all eventually got kill switches, and there were no traces of that C2 second stage taking place over HTTP. And so all of those folks were able to make it home in time for Christmas, as opposed to a lot of the other IT ops folks who were stuck over the holiday trying to clean up that mess. Now, doing this sort of retrospective analysis on IOCs, by the way, is something that applies much more broadly than just to SolarWinds specifically. In fact, I want to call out the Google Chronicle folks for having done something really intelligent in their products, where anytime you add an IOC into the framework, it immediately does a retro hunt across all of the data that you've pumped into it previously. And that's something that I think a lot of organizations could be doing today with very little effort in the technology they've got, but simply aren't because of, again, the overflow of alerts that are being generated in the first place. So, coming back to the triangle here, or the pyramid, I've talked about the sort of fundamental layers of a security process. These are the kinds of things that every organization ought to be able to do reasonably well if they're going to run a competent security program. And coming on into things like understanding threats coming against you and their behaviors and doing threat hunting, there's a lot of folks who consider those to be not only advanced, but perhaps so advanced that they're beyond the level of what they can feasibly look to pull off. And as my title here says, really, you want to not let perfect be the enemy of good when you're talking about conducting some of these actions within the upper layer of the pyramid here. First of all, because unlike a regular pyramid, it doesn't matter if there are some gaps within this foundation. You can still achieve useful outcomes out of attempting to do some of these more advanced hunts within an environment. And the reason that really is because you only need one sort of weird trick, one query that pulls something up funny, that is going to allow you to find something strange and start digging into it. And so, even if you don't have complete visibility into an environment, even if your data is a mess, you should absolutely be starting the process of threat hunting, even if it's as basic as something like, I want to look for all of the DNS activity that is going to non-authorized enterprise servers and figure out what the applications are that are generating those requests. You're probably going to end up finding something along the way. And case in point that's a little bit more serious than this, if you haven't read this book, it's worth taking a look at, because it's the story of how a 10-cent discrepancy on an accounting ledger eventually led a group of investigators to find spies embedded within government networks within the 1980s, before they had any of this technology to try to go find these things in an easy fashion. So you absolutely want to be doing that kind of threat hunting. And to that end, since I've talked about, real world code and ways to do a lot of these things, I want to point to the Corelight threat hunting guide in particular. It's a free resource available on the internet where we've aligned all of our network data into the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And not only given you a verbose document explaining how it all works, but gone ahead and generated a set of about 70 Sigma queries, which are the open source cross-platform way of expressing detections so that they can pop out into whatever SIM you might be running and be directly operational. This was all done in combination with the folks over at SOC Prime, and is operationalized through their threat detection marketplace. So you can go there for updates on these rules, as well as other detection and threat intel information. But I'll also point out that part of this is all coming from some of the proprietary content that Corelight is putting on top of the open source Zeek. In particular, we've got an encrypted traffic collection that takes a lot of the data points that were available in open source Zeek and consolidated them into more advanced detections that generate notices and help you through the process of finding brand new certificates or custom crypto in your environment, or some of these other things that might set off a hunt for something bad in your network. Now, of course, you're probably not going to be doing all of this behavioral tracking and threat hunting and other advanced work without some sort of off-the-shelf analytics. And to that, I will simply point out that it's a question of what kind of data is sent into them, how good the detections are going to be coming out of them. And so, between that and the fact that detections out of proprietary systems like these are only as useful as their explainability out to the analyst who's actually trying to implement something with them, it's no wonder that a number of vendors in the space have been working very closely with us here at Corelight on integrating our data into their products. Both because Zeek has been known as the comprehensive open source network telemetry standard for so long, so it predates some of our careers, but also because having that open data behind all the algorithms allows them to explain back out through their interfaces what exactly a detection means and how an analyst can do something useful with it. And then finally, I want to wrap up by talking about the ACT portion, the tip of the pyramid, the part where you found somebody in your network and you need to evict them. And the real question, of course, is how do you know that you aren't missing something when you've gone to clean up a successful attack? And with ransomware reinfection becoming more of a thing, let alone if an APT is getting into your network, it really is a question of making sure that you understand your environment well enough to be clear that you've actually evicted someone from your network to be certain that they don't come back and continue to cause damage to you in the future. I see we're nearly at time, and it looked like the chat was somewhat active. So I'm going to pause here and see if there are any questions from the audience.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Alex. While we do wait for some more questions to come in, please continue to submit the questions, and any follow-up questions that we do not get a chance to answer today, you may send them to q@sans.org, and we will be sure to forward them over to Alex for him to follow up. So first question I have is, you've been presented a lot of integration points with specific vendors. Can Corelight integrate with any other vendors besides the one that you've mentioned here? And then another question pertaining to that is, could I do vulnerability enrichment from my Qualys, for example?
Qualys,
Oh,
yeah.
Qualys, sorry.
Right, no worries. Yeah, that is one of the beauties of being an open core company with a commitment to open source and open standards. We can make all of these things work with whatever platform you may have. It's just a question of whether that integration is turnkey today or needs to be built out in the future.
All right, perfect. Another question is, the DCE RPC and the Corelight doc helped write Sigma rules before there are any print spooler. Are there any other gems and decodes in Corelight similar to DCE, RPC, and highlight?
Well, so I mean that's a broader question than I think we have a lot of time for today. But one of the things that I would say is, well, I guess two things I would say to that. One is that, there's a wealth of protocol logs beyond just HTTP and SSL that I've talked about today. So DCRPC, Kerberos, NTLM, Modbus and SCADA. There's a lot of coverage for other things out there. But to the point of the print nightmare stuff in particular and what we released around that, you'll definitely want to watch the Corelight blog soon because we are in the process of bringing our labs team into a more formal sort of Corelight recommended set of detections, where we're going to be building out more of our own content that is not only Zeek scripts or Suricata alerts individually potentially, but hopefully some that are going to cross those boundaries and really give you that complete enrichment of your detection straight with your telemetry.
All right, perfect. And we do have another question. Do you have time to answer one
I
more?
do, yes.
Perfect. All right. So we'll end with this last question. It says, what do you think of SOAR frameworks? Which product or tool do you recommend?
So SOAR frameworks, I think, are an important part of putting together a comprehensive program, because if you're in a large enterprise in particular and you're talking about very large volumes of data, having some sort of way to automate through those things is your best chance at actually being able to get through the queue appropriately. In terms of which vendor we would recommend, as you saw, we've worked closely with the Phantom folks to date and had a positive experience with that. But we've also been chatting with the Palo Alto Cortex folks as well. And there's no reason that the logic of what you would need to do couldn't be implemented in any of the different sort of frameworks out there. So we're a little bit neutral in terms of who we would recommend.
All right, perfect. Well, that's all the time that we do have for today. Thank you again to Alex for that great presentation and to Corelight for sponsoring this webcast, which helps brings this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcast. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS event.